Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on the Splatter portrait, which I have done a time-lapse on previously. Now before we get started in the actual tutorial, I do want to cover a few details in looking at the final image. So this is the image we're going to be recreating through the process of the tutorial, but some of the things I want to point out is that the method employed is really just a matter of using custom paintbrush patterns as masks and composing the image from those. Now, what makes it interesting, in my opinion, is the mixture of solid color paints to just masking of the image, different levels of saturation, and then having like your main focal point be the most prominent of the many different layers making up the image. So in this particular case, the most prominent part of the image where I want the viewer to focus is like the eyes and the nose area. So that one particular blotchy area is, the greatest level of contrast, the most color, and has the most detail of the man's face. So keep that in mind as we embark on this journey. So to get started, I do want to make a mention about brushes. Brushes play an important role in this creation process. In my case, the brushes that I'm going to be using, I get from brusheasy.com. I think they have a lot of good free brushes that are available that have a lot of really nice looking patterns. In this particular tutorial, I'm going to be using the watercolor set. There's just a lot of different shapes. There's a lot of different levels of opacity that I think will make the image interesting. And as well, I believe I'm going to use one splatter brush. But you can choose whatever you want, whatever you think is going to work. Do some experimentation. But this is what I'm using for this tutorial. So now procedurally, the first step we're going to want to do is create a blank background. So I'm going to promote our existing background and then say create new raster layer. And then we're going to use the flood fill tool and just fill that with white. We'll change it later, but this is just to make it easier to kind of see what we're doing. And essentially what we're going to be doing is making copies of this image and creating masks based on the paintbrush shapes. So what I would recommend is renaming this layer reference so that you remember to always make a copy of it and not to actually use it as one of the layers, because you're going to have to make multiple copies over and over again. So in that light, let's duplicate this layer. Then next we're going to create a new raster layer on top of that, and we'll flood fill that with black. And this is going to be the background of our mask reference. And you'll see in a little bit what I mean by that name. So then we'll create yet another layer, and this one's just fine. And this is where our brush stroke is going to go. So what we're going to do is turn off the background mask reference just so that we can see the original image. And this is where we're going to select the paintbrush tool and our first brush shape. So I'm going to go to my paint set where my watercolor brushes are. And really what I'm looking for is a shape that I'm going to use to emphasize the main point of the image, which the part that I care most about is the eyes and the nose. So something like a triangular shape is what I'm going to go for. So with that in mind, I think this is a pretty good one. So we'll need to, scale it and possibly rotate to get it to fit the shape that we want. And I like to paint with left clicking, and in this case we're wanting to paint white, so I'm going to swap my colors so that white is on the stroke. And then you just want to align, where you want this masking to occur. So maybe about there, and we'll just left click to paint white onto the image. So now we can turn on this background mask reference, and what you'll see is we've created a template for a mask of the image. And so now what we can do is select our copy of reference, go to mask and say from image, And the image we want to use is just the image we have. So essentially what we've done is we've made our image look like a mask, but we are saying we want to apply it to the copy layer of the reference. So we're going to use source luminance and hit OK. And you can see it's created that mask group. So now what we can do is delete our paintbrush, and we can turn off the background mask reference. And if we turn off the reference itself, then it'll be much easier to see what we've done. So you can see now we've essentially just cut out a part of the image based on the shape of the paintbrush. And there's a few things that we can do with this mask at this point. If, for example, you feel like it's a little too muted because the paint itself is more gray than white, what we can simply do is, with the mask layer selected, go to Adjust Brightness Contrast Levels, and then simply by dragging the top end here in, what we're in effect doing is making this region, the pass-through region, more white, and in doing so we're making more of the data underneath coming through. So you can adjust this slider based on how much texture or how muted you want the image to be, and then hit OK. Another thing that can be done at this stage is if I switch back to a regular brush, for example, let's say I didn't really like the way this last little blob is occurring here with the mask layer selected and regular paintbrush selected. If I paint black, so in my case now right-clicking, it's going to have the effect of erasing. So now you can see we've modified the mask in two different ways on our one, copy layer of the face. So now we're simply going to repeat that process, but for another blob, if you will. So again, not using our original reference, we're going to duplicate, and then we want to create a new raster layer on top, because this is where our paint brush is going to go. And we can turn on what we're going to mask, but to make it a little bit easier to see where we want to paint in relation to what already exists, we can just decrease the opacity of this guy a little bit so you can kind of see where was the original paintbrush, so that we can kind of line it up with the next one that we do. So now selecting the top raster layer, we have our paint brush selected, and now we can find another shape that we want to use. And I'm going to select from the watercolor, and in this case I want to use something a little bit bigger, just because I want it to cover sort of not just the bottom of the face, but the neck and the shoulders. So something like this per se. Again, probably needing to increase the size, maybe rotating slightly. And then after you created that paint stroke, once again, turning on the background mask reference, selecting our copy of the reference image, and we can increase its opacity now once again. And then we'll go to Mask from Image, and again, keep everything the same, our image source luminance, and now we've created a mask of that copy once again. So if we delete our top layer, our brush stroke, and then we turn off the background mask, what we'll see now is we have two. We have sort of this our focus brush stroke, and now we have the one underneath. And we can do some more masking effects here. Let's say just because we want to place most of the emphasis on that first brush stroke, what we can do is add an adjustment layer of hue, lightness, and saturation, and just bring the saturation all the way down. So we maintain the detail, and we get this sort of cool looking brush stroke effect, but it doesn't distract from where we want the focus to be. And another modification, for example, of the mask, we'll switch back to a regular paintbrush. And I'm not too much of a fan of how how much of the mouth is kind of missing right here. So what I can do is, with the mask layer selected, I can just select white. I can paint white. and it'll bring more of that back. So now repeating once again, for maybe the top of the head, we're going to duplicate our reference, create a new raster layer on the top. Go back to the watercolor brushes and then find one that can be sort of like filling in just more of the top of the head here. Turning our original reference on just so that we can get a better sense of where this brush is going to be placed. Maybe something like right there. And now with our brush in place, we can turn our reference of the background back, selecting the top raster layer first, and then painting where we want that brush stroke to be. Turning on our background reference once again, selecting the copy of our reference and bringing its opacity back up, then going to mask from image, keeping the settings, deleting our top brushstroke layer, turning off the mask reference once again. And now we have our third brushstroke, which is a mask of the face. And I think I want to desaturate this one as well, so adding another hue, saturation, and lightness layer, adjustment layer, and there we have it. So now we have an image that has just brushstrokes that mask out the image. And what we're going to move to next is just applying colored brushstrokes, not actually doing masks, just to make the image a little bit more interesting and fill more of the background. But before we do that, we should give ourselves a little bit more space. So the way we can do that is we can go to Image, Canvas Size, select Lock Aspect Ratio because we want the ratio of the height and width to remain the same. We want what we've created already to remain in the middle. So what this will do is as we increase one of these dimensions, it'll add to all sides equally. So if we give ourselves like a few hundred pixels on each side, then you can see now we have a fair amount of room, and we can always crop later. So then we can select our background, choose flood fill, and then just fill it with white. And then now we've got a lot more room for adding more brush strokes. So now we're going to add some more brush strokes, but we're not going to use masks. So it'll be a little bit simpler and possibly a little bit quicker. So what we can do is on top of our reference, we can just say new raster layer, and then we can go back to our paintbrush, find a shape, that meets, sort of just generally, where we want to fill, something that can fill some space but has enough detail that it creates interest on the image. So I'll pick this one here. You can see it's got a lot of jagged, edges and whatnot, but given kind of the way that it flows, I want to kind of flip it over maybe. Yeah, something like that. Maybe a little bit less. And then we'll want to make it a little bit bigger. Now, in terms of color, in this case, just because I want to kind of have a consistent color scheme, what I want to do is go over to my stroke color, hold Control, and then sample like some color on the man's face. This way, whatever I do end up painting here, kind of matches, right? It still kind of blends in with the scene without, so it adds interest in terms of shape, but it doesn't completely distract from what's going on. There's some consistency. So then let's do it again to continue filling more of the space. We'll select another brush. This time I want to do something kind of more in this upper region here. But I like the way this one kind of blends and fades a whole lot. So let's give that one a try. Make it bigger, give it some rotation. You know, maybe having it still follow sort of this. There is sort of like a path going along this way shape wise that I think I want to kind of maintain consistency with. So maybe about there. But then in this case, I think it feels like it's kind of too distracting from, once again, the area that I really want the focus to be. So in this particular case, I do want to adjust the saturation and bring the saturation down. And maybe it doesn't even need to be all the way, but just most of the way, so it's not taking away from this primary shape that I really want to be the focus. So then finally, let's add one more, and this one will be just a little bit more detail per se. This just gives it a much more kind of painterly kind of feel to it. Rotate it a bit. See what kind of works here. I think I'll go with that one, but I'll just make some slight modifications so that it's not quite so overwhelming. So we can just go to our eraser tool and just clean that up. And at this stage, you can kind of evaluate the picture as a whole and see if there's any pieces on any given layer that you may want to modify as well. So we're kind of nearing the end now, so it wouldn't be a bad time to crop if you want to reframe your image. This is where you can kind of decide how much margin you really want to allow around the image as a whole and what particles are going to be included in that composition. And then next, what I wanted to do was add a little bit of texture. So what I wanted to do was bring in a texture of some concrete. This I got off of textures.com. So what we'll do is we'll just rotate it, holding shift to maintain these nice angles, these nice clean angles here. Change the mode to scale and drag to have it fill the entire scene. And then we want to change the blend layer to dodge. So what we'll see is it has this effect of like really kind of like brightening things, maybe a little bit too much. So we'll bring it down just enough to kind of, you know, add a little bit of glow to things, but not completely blow out everything. Now, the other part too is what you'll notice is that because dodge has a tendency to brighten things, we have an issue of the background being blown out. But what we can do to mitigate that is instead of having white there, we want to put like a color. So if we chose something that's kind of in line with what we're seeing here, maybe like a peach-ish kind of color, maybe a little bit darker, and we were to use the flood fill tool on the bottom layer, then what we'll see is it has the effect of bringing all that detail back. Now this ended up producing a color not quite like what I really wanted, so let's change that a little bit. Definitely want it to be a little bit more muted. Maybe a little more on the orange side, so we can try again. There we go. So a bit, a bit darker. Almost there. Maybe bring the lightness down a bit. Now perhaps The simpler way to get where I'm trying to get to is to decrease the saturation. And maybe play around a little bit with the opacity of the top layer. Essentially, you're really just trying to kind of strike a balance with all the different colors that are in play and being able to bring some of that concrete texture in. And that's basically it. That's the technique, right? It's really just a matter of using custom brushes for the shapes of the different parts of the image, as well as just creating detail in color in the background, and then doing things like adding shadows possibly, or adding texture via like the concrete I had. But a majority of this type of approach is really just based on being creative, trying things out. If things are heading in the direction that you like, keep going. If they're not, delete it, or revert back to just a step before, and just keep iterating till you end up with something that you like. Anyway, that's it for me. If you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new content, click the subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me and the channel, check out my Patreon page, which is on the link on the screen, and I'll see you guys next time.